He was just a 17-year-old genius on his way home from tutoring until a white cop slammed him in cuffs, accusing him of a robbery he didn't commit. Kendrick's only goal was to make it to NASA. Instead, he landed in jail treated like a criminal for wearing a hoodie and having the wrong skin color. But what the officer didn't know was Kendrick wasn't just smart. He was strategic, and he had a plan. How do you prove your innocence when the system already decided you're guilty? If stories like this move you, don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts below. Now let me take you back to the night everything changed. They called him a genius, but Kendrick Rhodes didn't walk around acting like one. He just showed up every day and did what he knew best: solve problems. At 17, he had a mind that moved faster than most people could follow. While other kids in Dayton worried about prom and social media, Kendrick was busy chasing gravity, literally. Orbital mechanics, propulsion theory, and quantum physics were the languages he spoke when the world got too loud. He never talked much about the offers. MIT, Stanford, Georgia Tech. He said he was still deciding. What he really meant was he wasn't looking for the easiest path. He wanted the one that would test him, break him if it had to. Because Kendrick didn't just want to go to space, he wanted to earn it. He lived in a modest house with his mom, Janice, who worked 12-hour night shifts at the hospital. His father had been killed in a highway crash 7 years back. Since then, Kendrick had been quiet, focused, the kind of young man who always carried a backpack and never raised his voice. Not because he was afraid, but because he didn't need to shout to be heard. People who mattered listened. 3 nights a week, Kendrick volunteered at the community library. No pay, no recognition. Just one worn-down table in the back and a stream of overwhelmed college students hoping to pass their next exam. "You make it sound simple," one of them told him once. Kendrick smiled and said, "It is simple. Once you believe you're not stupid." That night he stayed later than usual. Marcus, an older student in an engineering program, was stuck on a problem. Kendrick broke it down, sketching diagrams, walking him through fluid dynamics, until the guy finally slapped the table and said, "I got it." "Damn, I actually got it." Kendrick laughed, closed his notebook, and started packing. "Told you," he said. "It was all in your head." It was 9:27 p.m. when Kendrick stepped out of the library. The street was quiet. Cold air brushed against his neck. He adjusted his hoodie, shifted his bag over one shoulder, and started the walk home. He wasn't nervous. Why would he be? He had done nothing wrong. But halfway down Oak Ridge Avenue it happened. A flash of headlights. A low engine growl. Then the sharp bark of a voice. "Hey, you, stop right there." Kendrick turned, squinting into the glare. A police cruiser sat angled across the curb. A white officer stepped out, hand already near his belt. Kendrick's heart kicked once hard. He raised both hands slowly. "Is there a problem, sir?" "Where you coming from?" "The library. I was tutoring." The cop's eyes narrowed. "At this hour? It's not even 10. Kendrick replied, his voice calm but his chest tightening. Another figure moved behind the patrol car. A second officer, younger, silent. "You match the description of someone we're looking for," the first cop said, stepping closer. "Black male, hoodie, backpack." Kendrick nodded slowly. "That describes a lot of people, sir. But I have ID. My name's Kendrick Rhodes. You can call the library." He reached toward his pocket, hands where I can see them. Kendrick froze. The air went still. The younger cop shifted his weight but said nothing. "Turn around. Hands behind your back," the officer barked. "I didn't do anything," Kendrick said, his voice breaking slightly for the first time. "I said turn around." The cold bite of metal snapped around his wrists before he could finish his sentence. Someone across the street pulled back a curtain. A porch light flicked on. Kendrick stood still, eyes wide, chest rising and falling. "Sir, please," he said quietly. "I'm not who you think I am." The officer leaned close and said almost like it was personal. "That's where you're wrong." And just like that, the night changed. The cuffs were tight. Too tight. Kendrick didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, arms pinned behind his back head, turned slightly to the side so he could keep the officer in his periphery. The world around him had gone silent, except for the hum of the patrol car's engine and the click of the metal locking in place. "Officer, please," he said, his voice steady but soft. "You've made a mistake. My ID is right here. I just left the Price Hill Library. You can call them. The officer didn't respond. His face was stone, his grip firm, almost like he didn't hear Kendrick, or didn't want to. Brent Malloy. That was the name stitched above his badge. Kendrick had seen him around before, never spoken to him, never needed to. Tonight, though, Malloy didn't see Kendrick. He saw a threat that didn't exist and wasn't interested in being corrected. Behind them, the second officer stood still, arms crossed, younger by at least 10 years. His name tag read, Grant. He hadn't spoken since they arrived, but his eyes moved, back and forth between Kendrick and Malloy. Like he was thinking. Like he knew this wasn't right, but hadn't figured out how to say it. Malloy pressed Kendrick against the hood of the cruiser. Description matches. Black male, late teens, hoodie backpack. That's you, he said. Matter of fact, like that was enough to erase everything else. I'm a student, Kendrick said. I was tutoring. You can check my phone. The texts. The library has cameras. You resisting? Malloy's voice snapped like a whip. No, sir, I'm cooperating. I just want you to know the facts. Malloy chuckled low and dry. I've seen your kind talk circles before, always trying to outsmart the system. Guess what? You're not in charge tonight. Kendrick blinked. His breathing shallow now, not from fear exactly, but from something worse. Helplessness. He had done everything right. Everything. Yet here he was, face pressed to a cold metal car, wrists burning. Sir, you're hurting me, he said. My arms. Malloy yanked the cuffs tighter. Yeah, they tend to feel like that when they're doing their job. Grant shifted his stance, still no words, still watching. Can you at least tell me what I'm being accused of? Kendrick asked. Robbery. Convenience store on Lincoln and 7th. Witness says it happened less than an hour ago. I wasn't there. I have proof. Please just let me show you. Malloy pulled open the back door of the cruiser and guided Kendrick inside without another word. The car smelled like bleach and rubber cold and impersonal. Kendrick sat stiffly, his back pressed against the hard plastic seat cuffs cutting into his wrists. From the passenger side, Grant finally spoke. Brent, you sure this is solid? Malloy slammed the door shut, muffling whatever answer came next. Inside the cruiser, Kendrick stared ahead. His backpack sat on the sidewalk untouched. His phone, his tutoring notes, his folder of letters, all left behind. He wasn't even sure they'd be logged or just tossed in some bin until someone decided whether or not he mattered. The cruiser pulled away, turning down the block. A few porch lights flicked on as they passed. Windows shifted. A curtain twitched. And on the corner, barely visible in the orange glow of the streetlight, a little boy stood next to his mother on the front steps of a house. The boy couldn't have been older than 8. He watched the police car roll by, watched Kendrick through the window. Kendrick saw him too. Their eyes met for just a second. Mom, the boy said, tugging at her sleeve. Why are they taking him? He didn't do anything. He looks like a teacher. The mother didn't answer. She just pulled him close. The car kept moving. And Kendrick, for the first time that night, let his head fall back against the seat. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just closed his eyes and whispered to himself, Stay calm. Think. You know how systems work. You studied systems, now you're in one. And that was the moment the boy who dreamed of NASA realized he was no longer studying from the outside. He was inside the machine now. And the machine wasn't built to let him out. They placed Kendrick in a holding cell without a word, as if his presence didn't require explanation. Just a name scribbled on a clipboard, another body in a cold room. The door clanged shut behind him, sealing him inside 4 dull concrete walls and a silence so heavy it pressed against his ribs. He sat down slowly on the metal bench, his wrists still aching from the cuffs. The air was still sterile, filled only with the low hum of flickering fluorescent lights. No clock, no windows, no sign of how long he'd been waiting. Just time stretching in front of him, like it had no end. Kendrick didn't speak. He didn't move, but inside his thoughts were loud. He thought of his mother. Janice would be on her break by now, maybe sipping lukewarm coffee in the break room of the hospital, scanning her phone. She always told him to text when he got home, even if it was late. She never said why. She didn't have to. Now he imagined her staring at her screen, refreshing the message app, wondering why nothing was coming through. His jaw tensed. For a moment he felt it rising, panic, grief, rage. It all flickered at the edges of his breath. But it didn't take him over. He'd been trained differently. He leaned back, resting his head against the wall. Cold, steady, and his memory pulled him somewhere else. A rainy day. Dim light in the living room. His father sitting forward in the old armchair, eyes sharp but kind. You ever see a lion roar, Kendrick? Yes, sir. You ever see one just look at a man dead quiet and the man still backs away? Yes, sir. His father had smiled. Which one do you think is stronger? Kendrick hadn't answered. He didn't need to. The lesson stayed. Now, all these years later, in a holding cell designed to break people down, Kendrick called it back. Not because he wanted to, but because he needed it. Because silence wasn't surrender. It was calculation. It was control. A metal key rattled in the door. The officer didn't step in, just opened the slot and said flatly, "You get one call. Make it count." Kendrick nodded once. He stood and followed his footsteps quiet against the linoleum floor. The hallway was dim and colorless, lined with locked bulletin boards and warnings no one read. A phone hung on the wall, already off the hook, already waiting. He picked it up, no hesitation. The number came from memory. The line rang once, then again. Then her voice came through tired and tight. "Kendrick, baby, is that you?" "What's going on?" He closed his eyes for a breath. "Mom, I'm okay, but I'm at the precinct. I've been arrested." "What? What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," he said, firm but calm. "Please, I need you to call Mr. Patterson. Tell him I need him here first thing in the morning." There was silence on the other end, then a deep, shaky breath. "Victor Patterson. Yes, he'll know what to do." He hung up gently. That was the hardest part. Not the cuffs, not the holding cell. The hardest part was hearing fear in his mother's voice and not being able to take it away. He stood there for a second, the phone still buzzing softly in its cradle. Victor Patterson wasn't just a lawyer. He was the man Kendrick's father had trusted most. A civil rights defender with a voice like steel wrapped in velvet. He'd once told Kendrick, "The system doesn't crumble when you yell. It cracks when you stay calm and make it prove itself." That line had stuck, and now it mattered. Kendrick walked back to his cell in silence, not slouched, not broken. He didn't pace or fidget. He sat down again, back straight, hands resting in his lap. He wasn't at peace, not yet, but he had made his move, and that quiet was no longer empty. It was the sound of something gathering. The storm hadn't come yet, but it was on its way. The courthouse smelled like old paper and damp stone, like a place that had absorbed too many secrets over too many years. Kendrick sat quietly at the defendant's table, wrists resting on his knees, the fabric of his jail-issued uniform too thin for the cold room. But it wasn't the chill that stood out. It was the weight of every eye on him. He didn't look like trouble. He looked like someone who'd been forced to learn composure far too young. Across the aisle, his mother sat stiff-backed, hands clasped so tightly in her lap they trembled. Janice wore her nurse's scrubs, a gray cardigan thrown over her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on her son, but her jaw was locked like stone. She hadn't cried. Not here. But rage lived behind those eyes. Not the kind that screamed. The kind that remembered everything. When the heavy door at the back opened, nobody turned until the footsteps changed the air. Victor Patterson walked in like he already knew the outcome. He carried no briefcase, no stack of files, just a calm that made people pause. Gray at his temples, sharp in his navy suit, he nodded once at the clerk, once at the judge, then made his way to the defense table. Kendrick met his gaze and stood. Victor extended a hand. The shake was brief but steady. "You ready to teach them something today?" Victor asked under his breath. Kendrick's voice was low. "Yes, sir." They sat down together. On the opposite bench, the prosecutor flipped through her notes with deliberate flair. Rachel Knox. Blonde, polished eyes that missed nothing and cared even less. She gave a small smile in Victor's direction. Not warm, not cold, just aware. The judge entered with a sigh that said he was already tired of the day. Douglas Harlan. Late 60s. Silver hair slicked back, thick-rimmed glasses perched at the edge of his nose. He didn't glance at Kendrick, just adjusted his robe, cleared his throat, and called the court to order. Rachel stood first, heels clicking like punctuation. The state is prepared to proceed, Your Honor. We are confident in the testimony of 2 responding officers who apprehended the defendant in a timely manner matching the description provided by a reliable source. We request that the court deny any motion for dismissal. Victor didn't move at first. Then he rose slowly, hands folded in front of him. Your Honor, he said calmly, we are equally prepared. And while we have no intention of obstructing procedure, we will insist on one thing from this courtroom today. Clarity. Clarity of facts of law and of conscience. The judge nodded non-committal. Then let us proceed. Kendrick felt the room shift slightly. The words had barely started flowing, but the tone had been set. There was no apology in Victor's presence. No nervousness. No need to justify why Kendrick had been arrested for nothing more than walking home after helping someone learn. During a brief recess, Victor leaned toward Kendrick. They're expecting silence or desperation, he said softly. We give them neither, Kendrick whispered back. What do we give them? Victor glanced toward the flag above the judge's bench. We give them law. Not the version they twist, the one that belongs to you too. Kendrick swallowed hard, then nodded. As court resumed, Janice sat straighter in the gallery, eyes no longer locked on her son, but now shifting between the people in power. She didn't understand the system the way Victor did, but she understood what injustice looked like. She'd lived long enough to spot the way it wore suits and carried clipboards. Victor cleared his throat and turned to address the court. And with that, the first true battle began, not one of shouting or spectacle, but of precision and proof. The courtroom wasn't ready for what came next, but Kendrick was. The courtroom was still as Victor rose from his seat again. No unnecessary motion, no theatrics, just a man who knew exactly when to move and when to wait. Your Honor, he said with the steady calm of someone who had already tested every word in his head. Before we allow hearsay and assumption to direct this courtroom's judgment, the defense would like to introduce concrete evidence. He paused. The silence dared to stretch. There is a security recording. He continued from the Dayton West Public Library. It shows Mr. Rhodes in the study room from 6:02 p.m. to 8:39 p.m. The incident in question, I believe, was reported at 7:15. Rachel Knox was on her feet before the judge could respond. Objection. This video was not submitted within the pre-trial discovery period. We cannot verify its authenticity or the chain of custody. It could be edited. Victor didn't flinch. Then let's view it together, and let the court decide if what we see looks like a crime or a child teaching calculus. The judge leaned forward slightly, adjusting his glasses. His tone was dry, reluctant. Is the timestamp visible? Yes, Your Honor. Has it been reviewed by a third party? It was secured by the library's digital system and preserved by the assistant director who is present if needed. The judge hesitated, then exhaled sharply. Proceed. But I want a record of who handled this footage from the moment it left that building. Victor nodded and gestured toward a staffer near the monitor. A moment later, the screen at the front of the courtroom blinked to life. There was no sound, just the pale blue tone of the library's overhead lights and the quiet rhythm of a study room in use. Kendrick sat at the far end of a long table, a spiral notebook open, 2 textbooks stacked beside him. Across from him sat Marcus Weaver, early 20s, fidgeting with a pencil and biting his lip like a man trying hard to believe he still had a chance. The timestamp in the corner glowed steadily. 7:03. Kendrick leaned forward, pointed something out on the paper. 7:14. He laughed softly, nodded encouragement. 7:15. Kendrick was still seated, still talking, still teaching. In the gallery, someone shifted in their seat. The only sound was the faint buzz of the monitor. Victor waited until the video reached 7:20, then turned to face the room. May I now call Marcus Weaver to the stand? Rachel remained standing, arms crossed. The judge hesitated, then gave a short nod. Marcus made his way up, glancing nervously around the room before settling into the witness chair. His voice shook, but his words were clear. I was there, he said. I was failing my engineering class. Kendrick offered to help. Free. We met at the library every Thursday at 6. That night wasn't different. He never left that table. Victor stepped forward slightly. What time did you leave? Almost 8:40. I remember because I texted my sister right after to tell her I might actually pass this time. Victor handed the message log to the clerk, who delivered it to the judge. Your Honor, Victor said quietly, that is 2 hours and 37 minutes. Kendrick Rhodes was in a public library helping someone else catch up to a future. That is 2 hours and 37 minutes he could not have been anywhere else. The judge looked down at the transcript. His brow furrowed. He said nothing for a long moment. Rachel stood again. We still need to verify. But even she didn't finish the sentence, because in that courtroom something had shifted. It wasn't just the timestamp. It was the stillness in Kendrick's posture, the clarity in Marcus's voice, and the quiet weight of that video playing a second time now, as if the truth wanted to be sure it had been seen. Kendrick didn't look at the screen. He looked straight ahead, breathing evenly. Rachel sat down. Victor remained standing, waiting not for applause, not for approval, but simply for honesty to land the way it needed to. And in that moment, the courtroom wasn't just watching a video. They were watching doubt unravel. The courtroom was silent when Victor stood again. The video of Kendrick teaching at the library had left a murmur in its wake, but now he was holding a new flash drive in his palm, like it carried the weight of truth itself. He nodded once toward the judge and said calmly, "We would like to present Officer Malloy's body camera footage from the night of Kendrick Rhodes's arrest, full sequence." Judge Harlan leaned forward slightly, eyes narrowed. "Proceed." The screen came alive again. The footage started in the patrol car. Officer Malloy's voice could be heard clearly, commenting casually on the night shift. It showed Kendrick standing still on the sidewalk, not resisting. His voice, soft but firm, could be heard. "I just left the library, sir. My ID and tutoring records are in my bag." The courtroom watched as Kendrick calmly handed over his identification and even pulled out a schedule printed with his name on it. Malloy took it without even glancing and tossed it onto the dashboard. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. Malloy reached toward Kendrick, grabbing his wrists. Kendrick asked, "Why am I being arrested?" And just as Malloy replied, the screen went black. For a full 3 seconds, nothing. No sound, no image. Then it cut back to Malloy, pushing Kendrick into the back of the cruiser, the boy's face now drawn and silent. Victor didn't say a word. He simply turned to the judge and let the silence speak. Prosecutor Rachel Knox stood up immediately, arms crossed. "Your Honor, technical glitches in body cam footage are not uncommon. These are issued devices prone to error." Victor finally broke the silence. He didn't raise his voice, but his words pierced through. "Tactical silence is one thing, but a black screen the exact moment Kendrick questioned his arrest is not a malfunction. That is a decision." The judge blinked slowly, saying nothing. Victor continued. "We have timestamp logs. The footage resumes 5 minutes later, 5 minutes that could have shown the truth." The room shifted. The jurors leaned slightly forward, the gallery fidgeted. Even the bailiff looked unsettled. Rachel tried again, this time less certain. "There's no proof the footage was tampered with." Victor turned, gesturing toward the screen. "That's just it. The absence of evidence in this case is the evidence. It always seems to disappear at the moment a black teen raises a question." Janice Kendrick's mother squeezed her hands together in the front row, her jaw tight. She wasn't crying. She was memorizing every second. The judge finally spoke, his tone more clipped. "Officer Malloy's absence from this proceeding remains unacceptable. The court wants an immediate report from Internal Affairs on the handling of this footage." Victor nodded, then turned and walked calmly back to his seat, placing a steady hand on Kendrick's shoulder. The boy hadn't flinched once, but his eyes had changed, not with fear, with awareness. And in that courtroom, the shift was undeniable. The lie wasn't just in the footage. It was in every glance exchanged between the officers who weren't present and the prosecutor who had started to lose her rhythm. And for the first time, the judge stopped looking at Kendrick like a defendant. He looked at him like a citizen. That was all Victor needed. Victor Patterson was not expecting the knock that late at night. It was nearly 11, and the city had gone quiet except for the man standing on his doorstep, pacing like his conscience had caught fire. It was Officer Grant. He did not speak right away. He just stood there, shifting from foot to foot, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his coat like he was trying to keep them from shaking. Victor stepped aside without a word, and Grant walked in like someone heading towards something irreversible. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Grant finally spoke. "I have not slept since the day we brought that kid in." Victor leaned forward, studying him. Why, Grant's voice cracked almost like it was stuck somewhere between guilt and fear. "Because I knew it was wrong the moment it started, and I did nothing." There it was. A confession not of crime, but of cowardice. of silence. Victor did not interrupt. Grant stared at the floor. Malloy said things, ugly things, long before this. He did not care if the camera was on or not. He called Kendrick a statistic waiting to happen. He laughed when I said the kid had his ID. Then he reached up, tapped his chest cam, and said time to give it a little break. He looked up at Victor, his eyes bloodshot. That kid did not do anything wrong. I stood there and let him get dragged. I have been thinking about his mother ever since, and my own. Victor exhaled slow and steady. Then maybe it is time you stop thinking and start speaking. That morning the courtroom felt heavier. Maybe it was the silence that comes right before the truth gets spoken. Maybe it was the weight of what was coming. Kendrick sat quietly beside Victor, still in his prison jumpsuit, but holding himself with the kind of stillness that made you look twice. His mother Janice was on the other side of the aisle, hands folded so tightly in her lap they had gone pale. Victor stood motioning to the judge. Your Honor, the defense calls Officer Timothy Grant to the stand. A few heads turned. Even Rachel Knox raised an eyebrow. Malloy blinked, clearly thrown off. He was not expecting this. Grant stepped forward like a man walking to his own reckoning. He sat down, took the oath, and paused for a long breath. Victor approached slowly. Officer Grant, please tell the court what happened the night Kendrick Rhodes was arrested. Grant looked directly at the judge, then at Janice, then finally at Kendrick. The call we got was vague, suspicious black male in a hoodie with a backpack. That is all it said. His words echoed too loud in the courtroom. We saw Kendrick coming out of the library. Malloy did not wait. He pushed him against the cruiser. I told him Kendrick was calm compliant, but he did not care. And the camera, Victor asked softly. Grant nodded. He turned it off, reached up like he had done it before, said no need for an audience on this one. The courtroom went still. Did you object, Victor pressed? Grant lowered his head. No, I should have. I did not. Why are you speaking now? Grant's voice cracked again. Because I saw that boy's face, and I heard his mother cry that night. And because I was raised by a woman who told me silence helps the wrong side win. Malloy looked like he had been gutted. He could not meet anyone's eyes. Rachel Knox shuffled her papers, avoiding the gaze of everyone in the room. And in that moment something shifted, not just in the case but in the air. You could feel it in the way the judge leaned back silent, in the way the gallery stopped shifting in their seats, in the way Kendrick's jaw tightened, not in anger but in quiet recognition that someone finally had told the truth. Victor let the silence hang before nodding. No further questions. As Grant stepped down, the room did not move. It just breathed. Because sometimes it is not the length of a sentence that matters. It is the courage it took to say it. And that kind of truth spoken plainly has a weight no verdict can match. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. After all the silence, the buried truths, the glances exchanged in shadows, it was finally time for someone to speak with finality. Victor Patterson stood slowly. His voice calm and unshaken cut through the tension without needing to rise. Your Honor, in light of Officer Grant's sworn testimony, the video surveillance from the library, the inexplicable malfunction of the body camera, and the prosecution's lack of credible evidence, the defense respectfully moves to dismiss all charges against Kendrick Rhodes. A few murmurs stirred the gallery, but Judge Harlan raised one hand. Silence returned. The judge did not speak immediately. He stared down at the case file, then looked over the courtroom. His gaze lingering longer than usual on Malloy. His jaw moved as if chewing on the weight of what he was about to say. Finally, he exhaled. This court finds that the arrest and subsequent treatment of Mr. Rhodes constitute a severe violation of due process and a gross misuse of law enforcement authority. The motion to dismiss all charges is granted. A sharp intake of breath swept the room, followed by a moment of silence so thick it almost echoed. Kendrick did not flinch. He had been still for so long that the news seemed to roll over him like a tide he already knew was coming. Victor reached over and touched his shoulder, grounding the moment with something human. But it was not over. The judge turned his attention to Malloy, his voice colder now. This court recommends an immediate internal review of Officer Malloy's conduct. Until that time, he is to be suspended from all duties and remanded for questioning by the district's oversight committee. Bailiff, please escort Officer Malloy out of this courtroom. Two uniformed officers approached, and suddenly Malloy did not look so untouchable. He stood frozen for a second, then turned to Rachel Knox, as if expecting her to object or intervene. She did not move. Her expression had hardened into something unreadable. As they took Malloy by the arms, he muttered something too low to hear. One of the spectators scoffed. Another shook their head. They walked him past Kendrick. Malloy did not look up. "And Kendrick?" He sat for one more second. Then, with deliberate calm, he stood. Victor leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "Let them see who you are." The bailiff stepped forward and removed the handcuffs from Kendrick's wrists. The clink was faint, but somehow it rang louder than any gavel. Kendrick's mother let out a quiet breath. Her hand pressed to her lips. She did not cry. She just watched her son stand in front of the system that had tried to break him and remain unbroken. He did not raise his fists. He did not smile. He did not even blink at those who had doubted him. He just straightened his back and walked toward the exit. Every step he took sounded louder than the last. People moved out of his way, not in fear but in recognition, not of his innocence, but of his quiet strength. That strength had outlasted suspicion. It had outlasted silence. It had outlasted a courtroom that was never built for him. And as he walked through the double doors into the bright hallway beyond, the weight of it all finally started to lift. But only just. Because justice, as everyone in that room had just learned, does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives with a boy walking free. Head high, voice quiet, heart intact. The sun had barely risen over Dayton when the news broke. Not just that Kendrick Rhodes had walked free, but that he had walked out with purpose. He hadn't gone straight home. He hadn't disappeared behind closed doors. Instead, he had walked into the heart of the community and asked a single question. What now? Within a week, Kendrick had gathered a circle of young men and women, some barely older than himself, some who had once sat in jail cells for crimes they did not commit, some who still wore the scars of silence. Together, they met in the basement of an old church near the library. The same library where Kendrick used to tutor strangers for free now stood as a symbol not of quiet study but of power reclaimed. They called themselves Second Chance Scholars. It started simple. Free tutoring, help filling out scholarship forms, a ride to and from court dates for kids who couldn't rely on anyone else. But Kendrick knew that wasn't enough. Not anymore. He looked at the faces of the boys who walked into those meetings still looking over their shoulders. He saw girls who spoke too softly because they had been taught that speaking loudly might be mistaken for defiance. He saw himself in every one of them. And then came Grant. No longer in uniform, the man stood at the door of the meeting room one Tuesday night, holding a worn notebook in one hand and nothing in the other. Kendrick turned and met his eyes. For a long moment, neither said a word. Grant looked smaller now. Not physically, but in the way that men look when they finally stop pretending they're right. He stepped forward slowly and said in a voice barely audible, "I should have spoken sooner. I kept a journal of things I saw, of things I should have stopped. I want to testify. I want to make it right." There was no applause, no dramatic handshake, just silence again, the kind that weighs heavier than noise. Victor, seated at the end of the room with his coat folded neatly beside him, looked up and nodded once. "Let's hear what he has to say." And that's how it began. A police officer who couldn't sleep now stood beside a boy who refused to stay silent. Grant became a crucial voice in a series of reopened investigations into cases that had been buried for years. Cases where camera footage had gone missing, where testimony had been rewritten, where the same names kept appearing, but no one had ever asked why. In one meeting, after reviewing a report about a 16-year-old who'd been held without charges for 3 days, Grant placed the folder down slowly and said, "I remember that boy. He didn't even have shoelaces when they released him." And Kendrick, steady as ever, looked around the room and replied, "Then we're going to find him." They didn't have money. They didn't have offices. What they had was a growing network of people tired of waiting. Volunteers brought food. Retired teachers offered to tutor. Former defendants trained others to understand their rights. And every Friday, Kendrick stood in front of them all, sleeves rolled up, eyes clear, voice calm. He didn't preach. He didn't shout. He told stories, real ones, of names that were forgotten and should never have been. Word spread. Soon, news crews came with their cameras asking Kendrick for interviews. One journalist asked him if he ever thought he'd be a symbol for change. Kendrick smiled gently and said, "I never wanted to be a symbol. I just didn't want the next kid to go through what I did." The headline that night read, "The Boy Who Taught the System." Victor watched the interview from his office, a half-empty coffee cup beside him. He didn't say anything, but he kept replaying the part where Kendrick talked about his father, where he said, "He taught me that silence doesn't mean weakness. It means you're listening." In a small community room with plastic chairs and mismatched mugs, Kendrick, Victor, and Grant sat side by side one evening going over a case involving another boy arrested for nothing more than walking home with a broken phone. They paused for a moment as laughter erupted from another table where two young girls had just solved a math problem Kendrick had left on the board earlier. Grant smiled. Victor looked at Kendrick and said softly, "You know your father would be proud, but not because you fought, because you built something." Kendrick looked around the room, his eyes resting on every face, every notebook, every hopeful glance. Then he said, "This isn't just my story anymore. It never was. It's ours, and we're not done." And no one in that room doubted him. Not anymore. The sun had barely risen over Dayton when the news broke. Not just that Kendrick Rhodes had walked free, but that he had walked out with purpose. He hadn't gone straight home. He hadn't disappeared behind closed doors. Instead, he had walked into the heart of the community and asked a single question. What now? Within a week, Kendrick had gathered a circle of young men and women, some barely older than himself, some who had once sat in jail cells for crimes they did not commit, some who still wore the scars of silence. Together, they met in the basement of an old church near the library. The same library where Kendrick used to tutor strangers for free now stood as a symbol not of quiet study but of power reclaimed. They called themselves second chance scholars. It started simple. Free tutoring. Help filling out scholarship forms. A ride to and from court dates for kids who couldn't rely on anyone else. But Kendrick knew that wasn't enough. Not anymore. He looked at the faces of the boys who walked into those meetings still looking over their shoulders. He saw girls who spoke too softly because they had been taught that speaking loudly might be mistaken for defiance. He saw himself in every one of them. And then came Grant. No longer in uniform, the man stood at the door of the meeting room one Tuesday night, holding a worn notebook in one hand and nothing in the other. Kendrick turned and met his eyes. For a long moment, neither said a word. Grant looked smaller now. Not physically, but in the way that men look when they finally stop pretending they're right. He stepped forward slowly and said in a voice barely audible, "I should have spoken sooner. I kept a journal of things I saw, of things I should have stopped. I want to testify. I want to make it right." There was no applause, no dramatic handshake, just silence again, the kind that weighs heavier than noise. Victor, seated at the end of the room with his coat folded neatly beside him, looked up and nodded once. "Let's hear what he has to say." And that's how it began. A police officer who couldn't sleep now stood beside a boy who refused to stay silent. Grant became a crucial voice in a series of reopened investigations into cases that had been buried for years. Cases where camera footage had gone missing, where testimony had been rewritten, where the same names kept appearing, but no one had ever asked why. In one meeting, after reviewing a report about a 16-year-old who'd been held without charges for 3 days, Grant placed the folder down slowly and said, "I remember that boy. He didn't even have shoelaces when they released him." And Kendrick, steady as ever, looked around the room and replied, "Then we're going to find him." They didn't have money. They didn't have offices. What they had was a growing network of people tired of waiting. Volunteers brought food. Retired teachers offered to tutor. Former defendants trained others to understand their rights. And every Friday, Kendrick stood in front of them, all sleeves rolled up, eyes clear, voice calm. He didn't preach, he didn't shout, he told stories, real ones, of names that were forgotten and should never have been. Word spread. Soon, news crews came with their cameras asking Kendrick for interviews. One journalist asked him if he ever thought he'd be a symbol for change. Kendrick smiled gently and said, "I never wanted to be a symbol. I just didn't want the next kid to go through what I did." The headline that night read, "The Boy Who Taught the System." Victor watched the interview from his office, a half-empty coffee cup beside him. He didn't say anything, but he kept replaying the part where Kendrick talked about his father, where he said, "He taught me that silence doesn't mean weakness. It means you're listening. In a small community room with plastic chairs and mismatched mugs, Kendrick, Victor, and Grant sat side by side one evening going over a case involving another boy arrested for nothing more than walking home with a broken phone. They paused for a moment as laughter erupted from another table where two young girls had just solved a math problem Kendrick had left on the board earlier. Grant smiled. Victor looked at Kendrick and said softly, "You know your father would be proud, but not because you fought, because you built something." Kendrick looked around the room, his eyes resting on every face, every notebook, every hopeful glance. Then he said, "This isn't just my story anymore. It never was. It's ours, and we're not done." And no one in that room doubted him. Not anymore. The auditorium was packed. Rows of black robes lined the stage. Proud families filled the seats, and the sound of slow, hopeful music echoed faintly in the background. But when Kendrick rose from his chair and stepped up to the podium, the room grew quiet. Not out of obligation, not from ceremony, but because every single person there knew they were about to hear something they wouldn't forget. He stood still for a moment. Just a pause, just long enough to let the silence breathe. Then he looked out not just at the graduates, but at the parents, the children, the professors, the janitors, even the security guards standing at the back. His voice, when it came, wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "I never thought I'd be standing here," he began. "Not because I doubted my ability, but because for a while this country did." There were no slides behind him, no fancy words flashing across a screen, just him telling a story. The story. The one that started with a hoodie, a sidewalk, a pair of handcuffs, and a child watching from a porch asking the question that stayed in his bones. "I was walking to campus to help a student with his final project," Kendrick continued when two officers pulled over. One had his hand on his holster. The other didn't say a word. "I handed them my ID, my schedule, my messages with the student I was going to meet. But none of it mattered. What mattered was the hoodie, the backpack, and the color of the skin beneath it. Somewhere in the middle of the crowd, someone shifted in their seat, quietly wiping their eye. They put cuffs on me, right there on the street. And while they did it, I heard a boy, maybe 8 years old, ask his mother, 'Why are they arresting the smart man?' That's the moment that broke me, and that's the moment that built me." The air had gone still. Even the banners hanging from the ceiling seemed to hold their breath. I spent one night in a jail cell, but it felt like years. Not because of the cold floor or the noise, but because I couldn't stop thinking about my mom, and about my dad, and about every parent who told their child to be respectful, be excellent, be invisible if you have to. I thought about all the times we were taught that intelligence would save us, that if we studied hard enough, spoke well enough, moved carefully enough, we'd be safe. He leaned slightly forward, voice steady. "But excellence doesn't protect you when the system doesn't see you as human. It only makes you more dangerous to it." That's why that little boy's question still echoes in me. Not just, why did they arrest the smart man, but the one beneath it. Why does intelligence scare them when it doesn't come in the package they expect? He paused, eyes sweeping across the sea of graduates. I never got to answer that boy, but if he's listening now, maybe he's in this very room. I'd say this: they arrested me because they weren't ready. Not ready to accept that brilliance can wear braids, that wisdom can come with melanin, that power doesn't always look like the ones who built the rules. Somewhere in the front row, a young boy sat up a little taller, his eyes wide-locked on Kendrick. He couldn't have been older than 9. His fingers gripped the edge of his chair. His shoes didn't quite touch the floor. Kendrick saw him, and for just a second he let his voice soften. "To that boy, I'm still answering you. With every student I teach, every unjust charge we fight, every system we rebuild brick by brick, you're not too young to see what's broken, and you're not too small to help fix it." There were no cheers. Not yet. Just silence. Deep, reflective silence. The kind that settles in your bones and stays there long after the sound is gone. Then, as Kendrick stepped back from the podium, the boy in the front row smiled. He didn't clap. He didn't shout. He just looked up, eyes bright, the way a torch looks at fire and recognizes itself. And that was enough. If this story moved you, don't just let it end here. Because Kendrick's journey wasn't just about justice in a courtroom. It was about silence that speaks louder than shouting strength, that wears humility and brilliance, that refuses to dim in the face of prejudice. At its heart, this story is a reminder that our systems may be broken, but voices like Kendrick's, quiet, unshakable, and deeply human, can reshape them. If you believe stories like this need to be heard, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded that truth, dignity, and courage still matter. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to follow more powerful stories from Mr. Max Stories, where we shine a light on the battles many fight in silence. Stories that echo beyond the courtroom. Your support means everything to us. It is what fuels our team to keep telling stories that matter. Stories that speak for the unheard, and stories that stay with you long after the final word. Because here at Mr. Max Stories, we don't just tell stories, we keep memory alive.